Norfolk's wildlife needs our help. Hidden within the county's idyllic rivers, native species are under threat. From pollution, diseases, and climate change. But one needs our help more than ever.
The species within maybe 2 years won't exist if nothing's done.
The white-clawed crayfish. An essential part of Norfolk's ecosystem, but it's being annihilated by an alien invader. The American Signal Crayfish. Introduced in the 70s, it has left a path of destruction and death in its wake.
White-clawed crayfish will have missing pincers and missing legs and injuries because the signal crayfish have attacked them.
So can the white-clawed crayfish be saved? Join one group of committed conservationists as they attempt to revive Norfolk's hidden hero. What kind of state are the white-claws in across the UK in terms of their future?
Unfortunately, most of the country is really experiencing quite a large signal crayfish invasion. Signal crayfish carry crayfish plague, which native crayfish have no immunity to. So they tend to die within 7 days of exposure and the whole population will be wiped out. They have absolutely no immunity at all.
But they're so important in a river system, aren't they?
Yeah, so they are known as ecosystem engineers, which means that they play a disproportionate role in the ecosystem. They have far greater impact than some other species, and that's because they help clear debris, they help keep rivers clean, they help predate on other invertebrates in the river because they eat other things, so that stops other populations, sort of going out of control. So having that species there controls so much more in the river ecosystem than another species might do, and if they're gone, you lose all of those benefits that the crayfish would provide. And because they are nocturnal, people don't see them very often, so they don't understand what role they play in the ecosystem and what impacts they might be having. And also, it's probably over quite a long term, so it's quite difficult to monitor. And that's another thing that people have highlighted, I think, over the last few years is the lack of monitoring because of the lack of funding and seeing what impacts those crayfish were having compared to what might be happening now without them.
Since 1991, the number of white-clawed crayfish have fell significantly across the UK. In some areas, dead zones have developed. In these rivers, signal crayfish have taken over, destroying biodiversity by eating everything in sight. But help is coming. Here in the tranquil village of Banham, the local zoo, alongside the Norfolk Rivers Trust, are planning a fight back. Hidden within the zoo, out of sight from the visitors. An exciting experiment is taking place. With the species' future hanging in the balance, the project must be a success. And lurking behind the covers, a crayfish laboratory, tanks filled with hope.
We've just brought in the fresh wild females and the babies have just hatched. They're absolutely minuscule, smaller than the grain of gravel, and they're so prone to absolutely anything. So if the flow's too fast, they get knocked around, it takes a while for them to get eating, they'll swarm over each other and suffocate each other. So it's these first few weeks where you have the most sleepless nights, where you're trying to really grow them on quickly to get them out of this delicate stage. So yeah, we're deep in the middle of it right now of the stress-induced crayfish, yeah.
Inspired by the work of Bristol Zoo, the keepers here have developed a new breeding programme. By capturing pregnant white-claws in the wild, keepers hope to rear and release the young in only a year. With perfect nutrition, water quality and no signal crayfish, their chance of survival increases by over 70%. A crayfish comeback.
It's definitely exciting, and I feel like really like honoured, I guess, to be part of the project. And I definitely feel like it's been amazing just to learn how to take care of these guys.
In only their second attempt, keepers Dexter and Zoe have had to learn about these nippy creatures quickly, as they work towards their first crayfish release.
They're really stressful. One of the reasons they're so rare and their population declining at such a fast rate in the wild is because they're so finicky about water parameters and they're so delicate to environmental changes. So when you're trying to fit a river ecosystem into an aquarium or into a hatchery, the man-made process has a lot more peaks and troughs than the natural process does, and there's occasions where water quality goes wrong or equipment fails, and you have to think on your feet because these guys aren't that tough, and a day of the wrong temperature or a day of no filtration can cause quite a potential chance for mortality. So yeah, there's been ups and downs.
Compared to the rest of the zoo's inhabitants, the crayfish are rather high maintenance. The team are desperately trying to get the babies to around 21 millimetres in size before they can be safely released. But to achieve this, very little can go wrong. Zoe and Dexter are always on high alert.
So today we're doing a bit of maintenance in our crayfish hatchery, which includes siphoning out each of these aquariums and removing the waste products. We feed our crayfish quite a mixed diet of proteins, including various invertebrates and mussels, as well as some plant matter. But these guys are sticklers for really good water quality, and if you leave these food items in there too long, they'll start to break down and produce waste chemicals like ammonia, nitrites and nitrates, and these can be poisonous and toxic in their higher quantities. So it's really important to be really vigilant with your maintenance, and that's why we siphon, and also we test our water quite frequently to make sure that it's safe and good for our crayfish. So I just use a siphon and I vacuum up in between the bits of gravel, picking up any of the old food and debris that could be crayfish waste, or it could be the food that we fed them that's been left in there for overnight.
Last year's babies have now reached the ideal size for release. An ark site will be chosen by the Norfolk Rivers Trust for their new home. That's a river free from diseases and, importantly, signals.
Their natural habitat are kind of like chalk stream, like rivers and stuff like that. So generally the chalk in those streams tend to filter out a lot of like the toxins and stuff like that in the water. So they are kind of adapted to being in quite clear and like clean water usually. So the main things that we kind of look out for are usually the ammonia, nitrite and nitrate levels, just because they're kind of part of the water cycle that kind of breaks down like toxic chemicals components. If any traces of ammonia, then that'll kind of make us need to do a water change just to get rid of that immediately, because a build-up of that is like toxic for them.
Keeping a detailed record of the crayfish's care, from water temperature to pH levels, allows the zoo to optimise the crustacean's chances. Results will shape the project for next year's arrivals. It's a big commitment, but every success takes the crayfish one step further away from their endangered status. The zoo first opened in 1968. Back then, it only had pheasants and parrots. Since then, it's changed a lot, with the zoo now home to exotic creatures from across the globe, exciting mammals, magnificent birds, and now crayfish.
Should more people be kind of taking note of this native species?
I mean, I feel like they're kind of, the cool thing about the crayfish is they're kind of a bit of like a hidden like hero, a little bit of like the UK's like waterways, because like not everyone knows about them, but they're definitely doing like a large role in their ecosystem. So like they like help with water quality themselves, as best as they can, as long as there's no pollutants and stuff. But yeah, they kind of help control like the food web dynamics and stuff like that, and they're also a really good indicator of water quality themselves. So like for like other conservationists and like ecologists and stuff, being able to see that crayfish are like thriving, that's a really good sign for them as well. So you definitely feel quite attached to any animal that's like under your care, but I feel like with these guys, just like learning more about them as a species and just like getting to like work with them, you definitely like appreciate them. And like although it is really cool working with like all the other animals here, it's just you can't exclude like the smaller ones, like the hidden ones you don't really see, like the crayfish.
I've always been quite fortunate from when I was really small. I've always had an interest in nature and wildlife as a whole, and even more specific, I've always had an interest in your invertebrates and again your reptiles and your aquatics. So I had that goal, that target to where I knew that's what I wanted to do as a career. I had just had that itch that I really wanted to work in like practical boots on the ground conservation, and I saw this role come up, and it was basically built for me. It's a role based in aquatics, which is my background and what I love, and it's with invertebrates and with conservation, and to me they're really, really valuable.
Zoe and Dexter's passion for these watery creatures is infectious, but the white-clawed crayfish still remains vastly unknown and unloved.
And what is your favourite animal that you've seen here today?
A giraffe,
A giraffe.
Yeah.
And what do you love about the giraffe?
because they're really spotty. A penguin, cheetah. Mine would be a sloth.
Sloth. And what do you like about the sloth?
I kind of like relate to it.
And what about you? What's your favourite animal being?
The kangaroo. My favourite animal has been the tiger cubs. My favourite animal was the snow leopards.
And what did you like about them so much? Why are they your favourite?
Just because the babies are really cute.
Probably the tigers, because I've seen a leopard so far and a cheetah as well as the tiger cubs. I caught the tiger cubs red-handed play fighting and they are adorable.
I like meerkats.
What have been the biggest barriers to the project? Obviously it is fairly new, not many zoos are kind of involved at the moment, and it's something a bit different for Banham Zoo as well. Yeah. Has there been any big issues with it, or has it been plain sailing?
It is a challenge when it comes to visitors, because getting people excited about a small brown furry job that you find in the river down the road against a tiger is quite a challenge. For everyone in the zoo, for the keepers, for education, for conservation, for research. So, but we feel very, very strongly that we actually have a duty of care to the animals in this country, as well as, you know, far-flung places. And in fact, so many of them are struggling. The biodiversity decline around here in Norfolk itself is actually quite, you know, upsetting. But if you take the crayfish as an example, so we put obviously crayfish into the education centre to try and highlight the plight of the mare. Again, they're difficult, you can't see them during the day. They're a nocturnal species, they don't really want to come out during the day. But they're so odd looking and very unique that you've got to get in there for education. So you can explain to kids, because most kids go, what is that? Looks like an alien. It's got a fascinating hook. With education with any animal, there's always a unique something about that animal that will pull you in. And once you've got them, it's called stealth education. You know, you've got them hooked, and then you can sort of help empower them about how they can help.
To share the love for this rather unusual looking species, a sample have been moved. No longer hidden in their secret lab, they have been brought to the Discovery Centre. Alongside snakes and stick insects, children can learn all about Norfolk's hidden hero. But with the crayfish being nocturnal, it may be some time before they come face to face with any visitors. Well, it was always going to be hard competing with some of the zoo's most cute creatures.
So I've come back to the zoo today because an exciting development has taken place overnight. Although the crayfish are not always the most expressive or interesting creatures to some, this seems like it's going to be really exciting. Let's go take a look.
We were lucky enough today to find a crayfish molt whilst doing our daily maintenance. And this is about exciting as crayfish husbandry gets. It's a fairly rare process which happens less frequently as they get older. Now, because they're invertebrates, they have an exoskeleton on the outside. Whenever they grow, they need to molt their exoskeleton. And this is a really labour-intensive process, and it's the time when crayfish are their most delicate. They're really soft, they can't really move, and they can't really defend themselves. So what you'll find is that they release a hormone if they're living in close proximity to one another, which causes a synchronised molting. So a couple of days ago, one female molted in this aquarium, and today another one has, and the next couple of days, I imagine, the last one will as well. And molting is a really labour-intensive process. They withdraw lots of calcium from their environment, and they require lots of elements like iodine to help them molt successfully. As they get larger, it becomes more of an intensive experience. They molt less and less frequently, but as they're smaller, they molt far more frequently because they're growing a lot faster and developing a lot faster as well. And you can see here the way that they molt is just part of their carapace pops open, and they'll pop out of here, and that's the process. I'll put this molt back into the aquarium at some point because it has lots of calcium and essential elements that they will then reconsume, and it'll help them sort of reinvigorate after the very labour-intensive molting process.
As the crayfish make such intriguing progress, it seems they might not be the only native species for too much longer.
The zoo have released a recent press statement, and in it they call it their vision for 2030. They point out a desire for a new and immersive environment at the zoo, and combining breeding programmes for UK native wildlife alongside their existing international species. And the new native outlook has not come without some resistance, with a small group of visitors sharing their concern about the future of the zoo's international animals. Now, of course, the crayfish programme is the zoo's first native species breeding programme, and that's been largely funded by the government and the Green Recovery Challenge Fund. Now, it's contributed over £93,000 towards the project, so it's been very significant in getting it off the ground. And it's clear that the zoo moving forward wants to do more of these native species breeding programmes. But if the public is resilient to this change in outlook, and with the zoo being a charity, of course, can they really afford to save them?
Surprisingly, we can get more grants for native species than we can for international. The focus of, I don't have to say the government, but I suppose the political landscape is very much honed, I think, on the UK species at the moment. Things like National England, the Environment Agency, they're all very much focused on native species. So I think getting the grant's never easy. Grant applying is a nightmare, but there is a lot out there that is available. There's a lot of support for zoos as well at the moment, which is great. But yeah, you're more likely at the moment to get funding for native than you are international species. So if we went and said, well, we want to revamp our gelada enclosure, or we'd like to do, I don't know, Scottish wildcats or something random like that, they'd be more likely to give you money to develop that.
The target for 2030 is clear, but work is already beginning.
This site here is our ATP arena. It's kind of a hotspot for wildlife, and it's kind of a mix of like grassland, but you've also got like the ponds and stuff like that, so it's quite a nice mix of different habitats. And we kind of just like walk through and just list what species there are and like the count of how many we see.
Every week, Zoe assesses the land and skies above the zoo. The data collected will form a biodiversity action plan. Its purpose? To find out what species are already calling the zoo home, and then make any improvements to keep them there.
For example, with things like newts, we can improve the pond habitats that we have, like with like different, like planting different plants in there, and like cleaning them out, and like making sure the water quality is really good for different species, and just changing different practices as well. Like for example, like cutting down all of like the grasses and the flowers and stuff like that. Essentially just seeing what we can do to then kind of increase how many species and what they need generally across the site.
And it seems the zoo is rather popular.
I'm a little bit distracted, I'm not gonna lie, because I did see another holly blue one again, so I'm just like, oh, potential. But there's like, even just in this area alone, there was literally like 5 or 6 or 7 species just on like one like patch. It was crazy. It's so cool. Even in like the animal enclosures, to some degree, we do let like some of the species, like native plants and stuff, kind of grow quite a bit in there, just because it kind of is quite nice to make it a bit more wild within the enclosures. But like in terms of like outside, like wherever we can kind of like help to create little patches that help to support the wildlife
as best as we can. It's definitely quite important, kind of helps to bring across the message to our visitors as well, to kind of like illustrate, like, although there's some really awesome species like that we have at the zoo, there's also some really cool stuff here at home in the UK as well.
It's been 3 months since my first visit, and the crayfish are nearly ready for release.
Currently we have about 85 crayfish in total out here, so we've got around 31 females and then 17 medium-sized males and 31 of the larger males. So quite a few in total, quite a few of the males and stuff like that, which is kind of normal for crayfish broods usually, but still not too bad on the numbers front for females, because they do tend to produce a lot of hatchings and stuff like that later on. But yeah, they've been doing pretty good.
I'm personally taking down a percentage of our crayfish stocks, about 4 individuals, to CFAS to be tested, and that's in Weymouth. They have their specialised crustacean testing facility there. Unfortunately, these crayfish will be euthanised for the tests, but it's essential that we test them before we release them into the wild, so we don't introduce any sort of captive-borne diseases. We test for general histology, so that's a mix of various diseases, but the most important thing to test for is crayfish plague, which is the most serious disease amongst crayfish. Once we get them tested, there's a little turnaround to get results, but after they're all verified that they're safe to be released, then we think about releasing them, and for that we need to microchip them, and that's for successive years and sort of quantifying your success in that project. When you're serving, if you're capturing the same individuals again, it means it's successful. Microchipping is quite a delicate process, because even though these are fairly well grown on, they're still quite small and quite delicate. You have to turn them on their backs, and in between their abdomen and their carapace, you microchip them. It's really small microchip because they're really small organisms. You have to be careful at what stage of their life you microchip them. So if they're just about to molt their exoskeleton, if you microchip them then, they can molt out and then they'll lose their microchip. And if they've just molted, they're too soft, their body's too soft, and you can harm them. So it's about getting that in-between stage. But that's the microchipping process. It is a little bit stressful, a bit daunting, but it's essential if we're going to validate the project long term and that we're successful in reintroducing this species.
We've got a perfect little site. It's a tiny little river. It's in Weybourne, and it even in the height of the drought, it stayed really well. Really full of water, which is fantastic, because I think that's the biggest concern, is drought and the impact of that. The other nice thing is it's got a lovely wooded section at the top of the stream, so it stays really cold, and it's got very, very strong spring-fed streams, so again, very cold water. We've installed some extra habitat, so some woody debris and some big cobbles for them to go into, and a few years ago it was restored also by the Environment Agency, so it's a much more natural stretch now. The landowner is very on board and very keen to manage it specifically for wildlife. So he does farm the stretch, but he leaves massive margins, so there's no chance of any pollution coming in, there's no chance of any soil runoff or anything like that either. And the other great thing is that there's no public access. So there's no risk of public moving crayfish plague in or putting signal crayfish into the stream. So it's a really low risk site with a very high chance of success.
What are your feelings ahead of the release? Obviously, there are a lot of positives, but their future isn't secure yet.
I'm erring on the side of caution, where I wouldn't say we're anywhere near a good outcome. I think the main thing is finding a cure for signal crayfish.
I've been here for all the ups and downs, and when things go wrong, I'm here, and when things go right, I'm here. But the release is the peak. It's our first proper release, and it's basically, it's a big reward for all our hard work. And I think as a species, white-clawed crayfish are their populations are so dire that we really need to think about longevity and maintaining these isolated pockets whilst we learn how to properly control the signal crayfish and to properly conserve them. So the legacy of the project is really, really important, and yeah, something I'm quite passionate about.
Very exciting. There is always a small element of nervousness around the release, just because we've had them here so long, and you kind of grow attached to them, but then you also, releasing them out in the wild, you kind of have less control over their environment and stuff like that, so there's a slight worry, but I feel like these guys have kind of, they've grown quite well over this past year. They've kind of handled different events. We feel like they're ready.
I do see them slightly as my babies, because it has been such an in-depth project. For like 2 years we've been completely immersed in crayfish. It'll be incredibly exciting to know that you are actually making a difference. After all of that effort, you're putting in 80+ baby crayfish when you know, out of those 4 females, probably only 10 would have survived in the wild. So percentage-wise, you're looking at sort of a 71% success rate against a 5% success rate, and it's so important. And if you think if we can get more zoos on board with doing these things, you know, then that's going to increase the population so brilliantly. So yes, I think I'll be really excited. I think we'll all be quite emotional, I think, to be fair, when we're actually just releasing them. It's a huge thing.
Now that the process is nearly at its end, it's hoped that the crayfish will be released to a site just like this one. When they're there, they'll be able to repopulate free from pollution and signal crayfish. It's hoped that the process will be a success and a long-term win for the zoo and the Norfolk Rivers Trust. Although it's not a cure for the problem, it's definitely a small win.